Hello and welcome to another edition of the Jack's Throwback Attack podcast. Good to have you back once again. If you remember, in the last episode, I was chatting with Tim Edmunds about his career working on some amazing, iconic children's TV shows. If you missed part one, do give it a listen. Tim chats about his early career on shows such as Runaround and Number 73, and later on working on How To, as well as his business partnership with Neil Buchanan, which led to the creation of Art Attack. This is the second part of the interview where we chat about his later career with the media merchants. Enjoy. I've asked a lot about Art Attack, and I really want to talk about Art Attack was my second favourite programme growing up. My first favourite was Zzzap, which was also media merchants. And what a unique programme that was. How do you create a programme like Zzzap?
How you create a programme like Zzzap? We were, the change of franchise, TVS into Meridian. Meridian wrote in their document to try and get the franchise that they would make a mainstream magazine show for the deaf. Right. So they then win the franchise and then go, oh my God, we've got to do this now. Janie Grace had put this proposal together. So she called us up and said, look, I'd like you to make a mainstream magazine show for the deaf. We said, that's interesting. We'll go away and have a think about it. So we went away and had a think about it, and we went and did a lot of research and went down to the famous deaf school in Margate and started to get inside the deaf world and realised that actually you couldn't make a mainstream magazine show for the deaf because there are two types of deaf. There's deaf with a capital D and proud of it, people who only use British Sign Language, and there's deaf with a small d, people who are deaf but who recognise that it's a hearing world and try to do everything they can to integrate into it. And you can't do one without alienating the other. So Neil and I were faced with this dilemma. But when we were down at the deaf school, we talked with the kids there about what their favourite programmes were. And their favourite programmes were, not surprisingly, Mr. Bean, Art Attack, and Game for a Laugh. And so when we came away, we said, well, what's the essence of all of these things? And the essence of these was basically that they're visual. Mr. Bean is visual. Art Attack is very visual. Game for a Laugh, in many cases, was very visual. And so we said, well, look, hold on. What happens if we were to make a show that was entirely visual? No spoken word at all. And then we said, well, okay, what's the context in which an entirely visual show could happen? And then we realized it was a comic, the world of comics. They were about non-verbal communication. So that's where the essence of Zzzap came from. And so what you had in Zzzap, you had Cuthbert Lilly, He's Dead Silly, also known as Mr. Bean, of Mr. Bean. You had Smart Artie, who was of Art Attack. You had Daisy Dares You, which was of Game for a Laugh. And you had the Handymen. And the Handymen were a really original way of treating kind of make and do and communication for deaf kids. Put them all together and wrap them all up as a comic, and that's how you have Zzzap.
Yes, and very iconic characters that people still remember. I find it hard to choose a favourite, really. They all had their own unique features. When it came to auditioning those roles, how did you pick the people who would become those characters?
Oh, it was absolutely obvious that Richard Waits was to be Cuthbert Lilly. From day one, from the moment we said, well, let's call him Cuthbert Lilly, He's Dead Silly, it was obvious Richard, Neil and I had worked with Richard on Number 73. I'd auditioned Richard as this twitching maniac who walked through the doors of a rehearsal studio, and I just loved him, loved everything he did. And it was very obvious that Richard could be Cuthbert Lilly. And he was called Cuthbert Lilly because the village that I lived in at the time, there was a guy there called Howard Lilly. And we thought Lily was a great name. And one of the teachers when I've been at school was called Cuthbert Bardell. And so Cuthbert Lily, he's dead silly, made us both laugh a lot. So Cuthbert Lily became Cuthbert. Smart Artie was always going to be a role for Neil. And Neil allowed us to create a bridge between the popularity of Art Attack and pulling that popularity through to Zzzap. The handymen were always going to be a lovely, lovely lady called Sarah Pickthall, and Sarah was the education officer for the National Deaf Children's Society, and she was a great ally to Zzzap, a great friend to Zzzap, and she advised us on all deaf matters and helped guide us through what was sometimes a minefield. And but she was this expert communicator with her hands. And Deborah McCullum, who became Daisy, won us over at an audition. She looked a lot like Minnie the Minx, and she had a great laugh, and she had a joie de vivre about her that made her obvious. So we put them together, and the formula worked. And we recorded all of those bits, all of their segments separately. Although when we came to make some specials, it was really good fun to put all the characters together in certain sketches. They were quite magical, those bits.
Absolutely, I do remember the Christmas, the summer specials. Those were great. The very first series of Zzzap had a character in it called Tricky Dicky, which kind of did Daisy's role. I mean, how did that come about, and why was it dropped after the first series?
How did it come about? It came about, it was out of Neil's and my imagination, to be honest. And we thought that there used to be a magazine called Mad Magazine, and inside Mad Magazine there was one comic strip which is Spy versus Spy, and these two spies who would try and outdo each other the whole time, and you never saw their faces. They were always cloaked in a big hat and a big Mac and whatever. And so that was the inspiration for, I can't remember, what's it called? Mission Impossible? No, it wasn't called Mission Impossible.
Yeah, it was Mission Impossible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And again, we just had such affection for Richard and such respect for his acting capabilities that we thought, well, let's let Richard do this. And he did it really, really well. In the end, it got dropped because Janie Grace at Meridian thought it was too threatening. She thought it was threatening that children couldn't see his face. So we said, regrettably, okay, but we kept the absolute essence of it, which was one character playing games on kids and getting them gunged. And we just replaced Tricky Dicky with Daisy Dares.
Fair enough. Daisy Dares become probably one of the characters everybody remembers the most, and certainly one of the ones that I enjoyed the most. And those games, in today's health and safety, would you get away with half of the games that were done? Because a lot of them were like a tarpaulin on the floor with some guns, yeah. and kids are slipping over. There's no crash mats. There's no soft landing. You know, yeah. It's mad what you go away with. But they did look fun, I have to say.
Well, the kids who came along to play those games certainly went away with smiles on their faces. They had a good time. It was naive. It was a different time. You know, would you get away with it now? No. Would you conceive of doing it now? No. Different times.
Definitely. But glad to be a part of them. In between the sketches, you had this amazing prop of this giant comic flying through the air with all the characters in their respective little windows waving and that. When you were thinking about how do we link the show together, what made you think, let's build a live action massive comic prop?
Well, because we were going to have live action comic characters, Cuthbert Lily was a real person, you know, and he lived in his world. It then became obvious that if he was real and Smart Artie was real and the handymen were real and you were presenting them in a comic, on the front of a comic, they would have to be real. And so that then determined that actually the comic, therefore, would have to be 15 foot tall, 5 meters tall. You know, it was blindingly obvious that to portray this comic as real and these characters as real, that the comic would have to be that size. So we got a comic made that size. And it had 9 working boxes on it. And we could at times have 5 or 6 of those boxes live. So you'd have Cuthbert in one box, Smart Artie in one box, the Handyman in one box, a leg waving out of another box, something moving, you know, and it was, and we had to make people believe that it was a real giant-sized comic. And the first time it had its outing, it went into the shopping centre in Maidstone, where it caused quite a strong reaction. So yeah, it was real. It was a real comic, a real full-size 5-metre comic.
Yes, and it's great to hear that it really was in the shopping centre in those opening titles of the first series. That's cool.
It was.
That's really cool. I'll tell you something that's come to my mind, actually, because I didn't see the first series of Zzzap the first time around, but they repeated it a few years later. And when there's that bit in the newsagents where there's a normal-sized paper comic with the Zapper on the front, as a 3 or 4 year old, I thought, oh, that must mean it's a real thing that's sold in the shops. And I remember asking my parents, can you go and buy me a Zzzap? And, of course, not such a thing existed. But did you ever consider making it a real readable thing? Was that ever discussed?
No, it was never discussed. And it would only have been discussed if it was going to be considered much further down the line. It would have been considered maybe around series 4 or something like that, when you realized that you had a minor success on your hands. And could you convert any of that into some kind of merchandise or whatever? But it was never a big enough success to warrant somebody putting up enough money to create an original comic. And no comic manufacturer ever came to us and said, hey, we love your Zzzap, we want to make it into a comic. Didn't happen.
Nah, that's a great shame. Would have been good, but oh well. With the Smart Artie segments, those were probably the most visual, like when Neil was drawing on the wall and then suddenly pull it off the wall and it was a thing. How did you achieve all of that?
The answer to that is peak white. That studio was not just white, but was super white. And so when it's super white, you can play tricks. So in a super white studio, Neil can draw what looks like a hole in the ground, and he can then disappear down it. Now, the drawing the hole is one thing. You then have to have a separate bit of set where you have a black hole and you can't go down it. But it's to do with peak white. So when everything is white, it can make certain things disappear. So if you have a black line there, a black set of stairs, you could climb up those stairs. It's a television trick. That's what it is. And we exploited it. And that was what the essence of Smart Artie was exploiting a television trick to make it look like Smart Artie could draw things and bring them to life. In essence, it was about peak white, super white, allowing you to create the illusion. That's what the whole thing was about.
Yeah.
And we would go into a super white studio. I shot all those. Yeah, I did. We go into a super white studio for probably 2 days, maybe 3 days, and we shoot a whole series worth of stuff.
Yes, no, that's interesting to hear. It's great because it was so visual, and you think, well, how did they do that, and how did they do this? And I mean, like with the handyman bits as well. I mean, you couldn't see Sarah's body; you can only see these hands, and the signs would come in, and the fridge and the props. I mean, I was always curious as how all that was done and stuff like that.
We built a perfect little theatre, a miniature, old-fashioned theatre, and Sarah operated behind the curtains. And but she viewed it that the blue hand and the yellow hand were 2 different characters, and they interreacted. It's just like you would if you had 2 characters on a stage. and then you had rows of seats, not with people in, but just with hands clapping. Because, of course, when the hands were waving furiously, that's the deaf equivalent of clapping. So it was a very deaf-aware section of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't realise till I was older that it was a design for deaf children because it was never marketed as such, but it appealed to everybody, really.
In the 10 years that we made it, nobody, not one person ever said to us, but there are no words in it.
No.
Nobody ever said that to us. And a very proud moment was, I don't know what year it was, maybe around the 6th or the 7th series, that we won the Royal Television Society Award for the Best Children's Entertainment Programme for Zzzap. And that was proud. That was a proud moment that this curious little thing that Neil and I had created out of nothing should, and with no words in it, should win this Royal Television Society Award. You know, Art Attack attracted its fair share of award attention. You know, it won a couple of BAFTAs and it got a lot of attention around the world. But Zzzap winning the Royal Television Society Award was a pretty special time.
Let's go back to the early days of developing Zzzap, which I imagine would have been around about 1992. Special effects were not done with computers that much. CGI was in its infancy or didn't exist. But you still had these graphics on screen. You had the comic panels moving across. You had the hand going through the screen with the remote. It must have been really hard to do that back then because you wouldn't have had access to the same kind of stuff that we do now with special effects. How did you develop all of those with the limitations that you would have had in the early 90s?
They were mainly done by people that we employed to do the graphics. So David Tasker was one, but Alan Scragg particularly was the main graphics guy for Zzzap. Really talented bloke. And we just, we said, well, look, this is what we want to try and achieve. And certainly the hand through the screen was very difficult and very cumbersome. But once he got it once, then we could apply it to everything. But no, it wasn't 92, it must have been 91. And computer graphics were really in their infancy in terms of what we were trying to do with them. So it was a lengthy process, but one that we eventually got there.
And it looked fantastic for the time, and I don't think it looks too bad now either. I mean, the bit where the frame drops onto the sketch and moves across, I always like that. And the hand going through the screen with the remote, I still look at that and I'm not sure how that was achieved with 90s technology, so very good.
Well, the thing that obviously was an X factor was the fact that we used live frames sometimes, so frame gags. So we tried to put one into every episode of Cuthbert, by which there was a live frame. In other words, he'd walk into what you thought was a wide shot with a frame around it, electronic frame, and then he'd trip over the frame because, in fact, the frame was real. And similarly, you'd have a frame come in with a person in it, and then they pushed the frame out of the way. So again, it was a live frame. And that was just one of those little things that we tried to get into every show.
Yeah, I did like that gag, actually. That was very funny. And you didn't always know when it was coming. And in some of them, when he trips over it or walks past it, that must have been quite a large prop to do that, yeah.
Yeah. But that was the name of the game.
Yes, I have to say, actually, I mean, hats off to the props department because they had to build some quite crazy things for that show. I mean when you think of like the Daisy Dare sketches, I'm trying to think of an example. I remember one where they had to climb on giant tins of baked beans, so somebody would have had to have built all those and a giant piece of toast to put the beans on. So hats off to them for building all those crazy things. I mean, every series you must have gone up to them and gone, oh, we want a giant tin of baked beans, we want a giant fried egg, we want a giant wooden spoon, we want this, that. I mean, hats off to them for building such crazy things for the show. And I think that's what's nice is the amount of effort that obviously went into it. Because as I was saying previously, I don't think you see that effort as much these days. But of course, it's all down to budgets.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But the Zap budget was tiny. It was tiny, and it was necessity breeds creativity. So you had to find a way of making a giant baked bean tin or whatever, but the budget was tiny.
Yes, absolutely. And what I like about the budget being tiny is that when it comes to other characters in the sketches, a lot of the time it would be other members of the crew. So I know that Nick has appeared in a few sketches. I know Matt Porter played the policeman. You yourself appeared in a few sketches as well as cameos in Art Attack. Was that good fun to do?
It was necessity. It would, very often with the Zap sketches, I'd be in the office doing something on one of the other shows, and then I get a call to say that you said you'd come and do this Armenian woman or whatever it may be in a DIY store. We need you in half an hour's time. So then I just kind of built up the office, go there, be made up as an Armenian woman, and then come back to the office. So no, it was a necessity. Of course, it was fun, but it got in the way of the day job a lot of occasions.
The one that sticks in my mind, I remember the DIY one, but the one that sticks in my mind is when Cuthbert goes to a toy shop and you're the shopkeeper.
Yeah.
And you're getting increasingly irritated with him breaking everything and dropping things. Yeah, so little Easter egg. If anybody listening doesn't know, that's you.
Yeah. And that was budgetary. We couldn't afford to pay an actor to come and do that. So, look, Tim will do it. So that's how that worked.
Fair enough, but it worked. It's a nice little Easter egg if you don't know. So there we go. I mean, the show was very successful. At one point, so many series in, we started having these summer specials and Christmas specials. And I mean, how did all of those kind of mini episodes come about halfway through?
I think probably the network centre said, look, is there any way of developing a one-offs of Zap? And so that's where we thought, well, this would be great to put everybody together, to put all the characters together. So that's really how they came about. It was just a kind of natural evolution, a natural growth of Zap. As you say, it was being very successful. And so people would say, well, what else could we do with it?
And the Christmas and the summer ones were great. One thing that I've always wondered is there's also a mini-series, I think it's between series 6 and 7, called Autumn Specials, but there's no extra sketches in them. It's just 10-minute versions with only 2 or 3 sketches in that kind of seem almost like half-finished episodes. I don't know if you remember them, whether you'd be able to shine any light on why these 4 or 5 episodes came about where they were shorter than a normal episode.
I have no recollection of the autumn specials whatsoever. But again, it would be the same thing. The network would say, look, could you do us some 10-minute zaps? We haven't got any money for it. We could pay you to do some re-edits. And so that's what would have happened, is that we would have re-edited bits and pieces.
Fair enough. Well, I promise you they do exist. I mean, what surprises me is for a show that had no speaking in it, Art Attack was very successful, but comedy shows that have no speaking in them tend to be very well received internationally. As far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, Zap didn't really go anywhere outside the UK. I think there was some sketches shown in America, but in terms of non-English speaking countries, it didn't seem to go over there. Was there any reason?
Yes, there is. It was the words on screen. Because we put those words directly onto screen, so, Daisy would be holding up a tin which said baked beans on it. So it was the words on the screen that couldn't be replaced that stopped it being sold internationally. Also, those kind of comics, Beano, Dandy type comics, are very British.
Yes, that's very true, actually. Now you mention it, it makes sense. It is a very British institution, but it was something I did wonder. I have seen, for some reason, I don't know why, there was a programme in America, and I have seen a clip somewhere, and it's called Itsy Bitsy Time. I think it was on Fox, and it was a programme where they would show clips from lots of different kids shows, and they show the Handymen sketches and the Smart Arty, but for some reason they changed the name of Smart Arty and called it Art to Art with Arty Art, and actually re-edited the picture that's used on the comic, which is a terrible name. But I do know that bits of it, but not all of it, was shown in the US. So that's the one place it did get shown.
We've had no control over that whatsoever.
That's fair enough. Well, I have one more question about Zzzap. You created this show for deaf children, but the show was popular amongst all children as well. And I also think it appealed to those with autism too. I should know because I am one of them. Why do you think the show was enjoyed so much and is still fondly remembered now?
Okay, it may well have been created out of a brief to make a magazine show for deaf kids, but the fact that we had no language in it at all meant that anybody for whom English was not their first language, this was perfect for them. It was a very universal show. It appealed incredibly broadly because it was just so visual and didn't rely on language at all. As to its longevity, I think it's probably people like you that really loved it so much as a kid who kind of kept it alive. And it was different. It was unique. It was there hasn't been another show like Zzzap.
Very true indeed. I think it would be difficult to do Zzzap now. As we said earlier, the health and safety would be a major issue, but also the live-action comic is hard to do in the more modern 16:9 rectangular widescreen television formats. Originally it was done in 4:3 in the square format, and of course the comic had square panels on the front. And the final series of Zzzap actually was done in 16:9, and they didn't have the live action bits in between the sketches. They did like an animated sequence with the comic. So yeah, it'd be hard to do that really in the modern formats. I do think that Zzzap should remain firmly in the 90s as a show that's fondly remembered from that era. One show that the Media Merchants did that I thought was great, but I don't think is that well remembered now, was It's a Mystery. I really liked that show, and for anybody who may not remember, it was basically a show that would do reconstructions of strange goings-on, paranormal stuff, and then kind of leave it up to you to decide what was the outcome and would reveal the outcome of whether it was solved or not. The Media Merchants had done an art show, a comedy show. What made you decide to do a show about spooky goings-on and the paranormal?
I think in its essence, Jack, was the fact is a simple thing, true or false. You know, here you were saying to kids, look, this is supposed to have happened. This is supposed to have happened. But could this have happened? What do you think? What do you think was always the key line delivered straight to camera, because you're talking to the child at home, sitting on the sofa, saying, look, we've told you what the facts are. What do you think? And what that does is that it engages the child. It's not just a bunch of bland stuff that's being put. You are being asked what your opinion is. That was in essence, I suppose, where there was all that kind of Ripley's True or False and the X-Files, but all of it came down to what do you think? And that was the key to it. And we ran it for 4 series, I think, and had a good time making it. I mean, Nick speaks so fondly of his time there making it, and it was another very stylish show. It was a very definitely a Media Merchant show. You know, the studio set was half black, half white. You know, and so it was actually quite a simple show. But the key to it was, what do you think?
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I do know that there's a channel on YouTube who's done some very in-depth reviews and lookbacks on It's a Mystery, which are quite good and quite funny, actually. So there are some people who do really fondly remember the show. I think what most people remember is some of the mysteries. I think the one that most people remember is the faces in the floor one. I remembered one where a bright orb of light were terrifying people in their homes, and I think it turned out to be lightning or something like that. And there was one with a UFO, but it was actually a balloon with a light attached to it. So I remember all those. So yeah, it was a great show, and it was certainly different. I don't think there was anything similar on Kids TV at the time. I don't think there has been since. And now you mention it, at the time there was all that hype around the X-Files. It makes perfect sense why you decided to do that program. So very, very clever.
Okay, Jack, here's a very simple thing. We could make a mystery out of anything. basically. So at home, where I was living then, we heard a kerfuffle in the night and came downstairs to find the window broken. Okay, but the window was broken from the inside out. So how on earth could this have happened? You know, it's a mystery to us. Was it a ghost? You know, was it some other form? And in fact, it turns out that a bird had flown down the chimney, and in order to get out, had gone straight to the window and smashed through the window. But that was a true story that happened, but which we then dressed up into being a mystery.
That's very clever. I don't remember that particular mystery, but then I didn't see every episode, but that's very clever. You must have been really busy with all the different shows you were making at the time.
It was, so we were running Art Attack, and at the same time we were running Zzzap, and at the same time we were running It's a Mystery, and probably at the same time we were running Terror Towers. There was a period of time from probably 93, something like 93, through to 1999, where we were running at least 4 shows a year, 2 of which were Art Attack and Zzzap. So it was quite a big operation, but all done with people that we know and loved and trusted, and people that we had brought into the company. People, I said before, people who had the right attitude, and we could teach them how to make television properly.
Yes, all great shows and very fondly remembered. And you mentioned Terror Towers just, and I do know that those that grew up with that show really loved it and fondly remember it. And one thing I have been told about that show by Nick Ayling is that the set was so big, because you had the various rooms of the haunted castle and the big sink at the end, that it was spread across 2 studios. Is that correct?
2 studios and the scene dock at Maidstone. So we had 3 parts of the main set in the big studio. We had 1 room of the house set up in the smaller studio, and the maze was set up in the scene dock. So it was it's a show that ran over 3 studios, basically. It was a big set. It was a very big set.
Wow, that's quite something that you had to hire out the entire studios for it.
Yeah,
yeah, it looked impressive and very fondly remembered amongst its fans. And another show where you'd used people who'd worked on other shows. So Steve Johnson obviously did Motormouth, and Francis was Boris, and he speaks fondly of doing that particular character, actually, which is all good.
Yeah, well, it was, and again, it was unmistakably a Media Merchant show, because it was very, very visual. It was a themed game show for kids, but where every element of the theme had to work. So, we didn't have a scoreboard. We had a dangling spider. Each part of what goes to make up a standard game show was terrorized in some way.
Yes, absolutely. And plenty of guns, which was the staple of 90s kids TV and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Before I kind of move on to the very end of the Media Merchants and all of that, just reel off some of the other shows that the Media Merchants made, aside from the ones I've already talked about.
We did an ill-fated show called Telegantic Megavision, which was supposed to be... We were approached by Warner Brothers to do a co-production with Warner Brothers, which is very flattering, to a small company in Maidstone, to be asked by Warner Brothers to do a co-production. And their version of a co-production was that they would supply the content, and we'd produce the wraparound. And by content, it meant that their cartoons and access to their studios in Burbank in California, to be able to go and see behind the scenes at this film or that film, or the makeup department here or that. And why I say it was ill-fated was that once the agreement had been made with Warner Brothers, they then pulled right back, and they didn't allow us access to anything in Burbank. It was so it was a very, very, very lopsided show, which relied way too much on stuff that we would try and create in Maidstone. So basically, we tried to create the insides of an American television studio, but in Maidstone. And it was tough. It was really tough. And it was bad-tempered. And in the end, the network centre said at the end of the first series, look, we understand your frustration with Warner Brothers. We understand you've been hung out to dry. We'll cancel this show, Telegantic Megavision, but we'll let you have another go at Saturday morning. And so we had another go at making a live Saturday morning show called Wow, which was very studio-based, a lot of fun and games and standard Saturday morning fodder. But that was much more enjoyable than Telegantic Megavision, which was, I think, probably the low point of the Media Merchants output.
Oh, that's really interesting. What I've heard, because Wow was a really big Saturday morning show on ITV, big studio, lots of guests, pop acts, celebrities, games, stuff like that. And it was to rival Live and Kicking on the BBC. And the only reason it only got one series, from what I've heard, is because ITV decided to buy the rights to show Formula One. So therefore there wasn't the budget to do a second series.
Yeah, that's about right. That's about right. So the memorable things from Wow were, it was nice to work with Simeon Corti, who we brought over from the BBC. There was a live performance by the Spice Girls, which was memorable. A couple of other big bands, and a comedy duo who performed as the Dinner Ladies, who were very fun. It had a vibe about it. It was good fun to be in that studio on a Saturday morning.
It certainly looked good fun. And Simeon Corti's been on this podcast before, and he spoke highly of it. And I've also spoken to Sophie, who speaks highly of her time on that. And also It's a Mystery and Zzzap as well.
She's a trooper.
Indeed, indeed. So let's go back to the early 2000s. Media Merchants was sold to Britt Allcroft and later taken over by Hit Entertainment. From what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Media Merchants did continue as a brand name, but was under the ownership of those companies. Is that correct?
Not really. I mean, the Media Merchants still had a name and it still employed people, but actually we were a subsidiary, we were working for somebody else. So we were working for the Britt Allcroft organisation or for HIT. And the Britt Allcroft Corporation didn't really ever understand the Media Merchants. They bought the company, they bought the library, they bought the cash flow. And what they initially wanted to do was because they saw that Neil and I had the ability to write hit shows, and they wanted us to write more hit shows. So they said, when we sold the company to them, they said, look, what we want you guys to do is go and write. Go and oversee the output of the Media Merchants, but go away and write. And we thought this was music to our ears. So we did that when Neil and I disappeared off, and we wrote a lot. We constructed some really what we felt were first-rate shows, but unfortunately, the Britt Allcroft organisation didn't understand how to follow that through. So though we wrote, I think, 6 or 7 shows in that period of 6 months and then presented them to them, they didn't know what to do with them. And amongst those was a show that would have been a phenomenal hit, but we weren't allowed to make it, and later for contractual reasons we weren't allowed to make it. And it was a sports show. It was a sports show that was called Sport Attack, and it was to do for sport what Art Attack did for art. That would have been a hit show. And there were a couple of others, but after 6 months, Neil and I presented all this stuff to the Britt Allcroft company. They didn't have a clue what to do with it, and so in the end, we just said, "Okay, let's not bother writing anymore." It's a bit like an author writing a great outline for a novel and then have to burn it in front of your eyes. It was, but we'd made our decision. We'd sold the company. We knew we were going to be working for somebody else. We thought the terms of working for somebody else was be to write loads more hit shows, which we tried to do, and in the end, they didn't know how to handle it.
Oh, that's a shame, that is. Big shame.
It is. Yeah, it is. It is. Um, and Hit bought the Bridalcroft Company, and that was a little more hopeful. But again, we were just a small, successful little adjunct down in Maidstone who were, allowed to wither away.
Sad times. Because, yeah, you were making all these shows, and then towards the end, you were just making Art Attack. That was the only one, wasn't it?
Last man standing. Yeah, by that point we were making all of these shows for Disney, the international shows for Disney, and then in the end, Disney said, "Hold on, why do we need to commission any more? We've got 7 series of 26 episodes for all of these countries. Why do we need another 26 shows to make an 8th series?" Because they felt that they could simply just repeat them. So in the end, when Disney said, "Look, guys, we love Art Attack, but we don't need any more," that sort of symbolized the end of it. And that must have been 2006. 2006, I would think. So we had this extraordinary run of media merchant shows from 1991, when we got hold of Art Attack, got the rights to Art Attack, and we invented Zzzap. We then won the first of 2 BAFTAs, and then we won the BAFTAs. Work stuck to us. And so 91 to 99 were intensely busy, highly creative, really happy times, buzzing company down in Maidstone, lovely people coming to work for us. And then it kind of got a bit too big for us, I think, looking back. But anyway, we made some great shows, and I'm very proud of that.
You absolutely did. And as somebody who loved those programs, and those programs, cheered me up when I was having a bad day. Even sometimes now, as an adult, if I'm having a bad day, sometimes I'll go onto YouTube and watch something that I liked as a child, and it makes me feel better, and I know it makes other people feel better. And I mean, for me personally, who kind of struggled with forming friendships or kind of outdoor kind of things, being at home and losing myself into Zzzap or Art Attack or It's a Mystery was a big part. I mean, one thing that always kind of engrossed me was a lot of the music used in the show and the visuals. And so for me, I want to say a massive thank you for, making those shows. I'm sure there's a lot of people who do as well. And I mean, how does it feel all these years later that the shows that you made are still being talked about? They're still being watched. People are dressing up as some of the characters sometimes, at various events. I mean, how does that feel that people still remember it?
It feels great. It feels great. It feels great that they did the job that they were set out to do, which was to have an impact on children. I think I said to you before, I have a 6-year-old granddaughter who absolutely gets Art Attack. I mean, in the same way that she would have done 25 years ago. It has the same impact. It makes her want to do things, and that's a really good thing. One of the things I meant to say to you, Jack, is that the Media Merchants was an extraordinarily creative company, and it was extraordinarily creative. It started with Neil's and my creativity, which is they're quite different types of creativity. Neil's is quite pure, raw ideas, raw ideas, and mine's slightly different, slightly more structural. But it was all based on a simple equation. And this equation is 1 + 1 = 3. Okay. Neil's 1 and my 1 created something new, something different. And a very influential thing happened. I heard a radio piece about an advertising agency, and one of the guys said, in this advertising agency, when you went into a creative room, you never negated somebody else's idea. If somebody else's idea was rubbish, the important thing was to find one tiny bit inside it, praise it, and see if you could develop that. And that's a lot of what Neil and I did. 1 + 1 = 3. So we would sit around and we would play kind of a game of what if, that you'd always say, well, what if you did this? And the other person would say, well, yeah, but that bit there, where you said this would happen, what if we developed it that way? What if? Always struggling to find the new, the original, the three parts of the equation. 1 + 1 = 3. And that's what virtually all Media Merchant stuff was based upon. That basic creativity.
And creative it certainly was. After Media Merchants finished, Disney eventually did purchase Art Attack. They wanted it for years. They eventually got it and made their own version for the international markets and one for the UK as well. I think for anybody of a certain age in the UK, it was horrifying to see it with somebody else on there. But, we weren't part of the target audience anymore. It must be weird to watch one of your creations be done by somebody else in their vision. That must be a really surreal experience.
Yeah, it was disappointing. And it was disappointing because they copied an awful lot of what we created for Art Attack, but they didn't ever understand the DNA of Art Attack. They didn't understand what it was based on. They didn't understand the thinking behind it. They hadn't had the conversations late night in the Art Attack office with Helen, Adriana, and Nick, and Neil, and myself, where you'd chucked out a load of rubbish in order to come to the one little gem bit. And that's the kind of the DNA of Art Attack. And what Disney made, they didn't understand the DNA. They were able to copy certain things, but never to understand it. The Art Attack that we know and love, you could spot it a mile off because it was very distinctly and uniquely Art Attack. And other people may copy it, and that's terribly flattering, but it's not Art Attack.
That's very true. If it had a white background, if it had large pencils and paint splats on it, you instantly recognise it as Art Attack.
Yep.
Anything, any of the merchandise or any of the artwork that was going around.
Yep. So no, I mean, how do I feel about it? I feel very happy. I feel very happy to have been fortunate enough to make some very good telly at a time where children's television was very important, and to have left some kind of televisual legacy is great. And the fact that Nick and Driana, it's terrific television, they've really picked up on where the Media Merchants ended up, where we stopped doing it. They've taken the baton and are moving forward with it, and that gives me great pride, because they're both fine program makers.
Yes, I will absolutely agree on that one. So Tim, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you and having a great discussion about all these wonderful shows, and as I say, thank you for making them possible, and I hope you've enjoyed it too.
I've very much enjoyed our conversation, Jack, and it's lovely that there are people like you who still hold a flame for these programs, because they had an impact at the time, and it's nice to hear that you're keeping them alive.
Thank you, and thank you for taking part.
Okay, and to you, thanks.
A big thanks to Tim for chatting with me and sharing so many great memories. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you've enjoyed this series too. It's been great fun. You've been listening to the Jack's Throwback Attack podcast with me, Jack Hayward. Goodbye.